The grand lobby of Blake Enterprises glowed with polished marble floors that reflected the golden chandeliers above. Men and women in sharp suits moved gracefully, carrying glasses of sparkling water and wine as they mingled with confidence. It was the company's annual celebration, a night where the CEO, Richard Blake, proudly showcased the achievements of his empire. Every corner smelled of wealth, expensive perfumes, freshly cut flowers, and leather briefcases. The atmosphere was thick with ambition, pride, and admiration for power. Through the revolving glass doors, however, entered a figure that didn't fit the scene. Carlos Alvarez, a quiet janitor in his 50s, stepped inside hesitantly. His faded uniform hung loosely on his lean frame, and his work boots tapped against the marble, sounding louder than they should have in the elegant silence. He held a simple folded invitation in his hand, one given to him personally by his daughter. Carlos looked around the vast lobby with cautious eyes. He wasn't used to such grandeur. The walls stretched up high, decorated with portraits of leaders, awards, and glossy displays of the company's latest achievements. For a moment, he considered turning back, leaving before anyone noticed him, but his daughter's words replayed in his mind. "Papa, I want you to see me tonight. Please come. I wouldn't be here without you." Those words gave him courage. He adjusted his cap nervously and took a step forward. He had spent years cleaning office hallways in silence, often passing by rooms where executives made decisions that shaped lives. But tonight, he wasn't here to clean. Tonight, he was here for his daughter, the pride of his life. But not everyone saw it that way. From the staircase above, Richard Blake, the CEO himself, noticed the man in the janitor uniform. Richard was tall, commanding, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that spoke of wealth and power. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Carlos blending awkwardly among the sharply dressed crowd. The chatter in the lobby softened as others followed Richard's gaze. In a room where everyone wore elegance like armor, the janitor looked like an outlier. Richard stepped forward, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble. His voice carried through the lobby, crisp and cutting. "Excuse me," he called out, his tone laced with authority. "You. What are you doing here?" Carlos froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, whispering. Some frowned, some smirked, others simply watched in silence, waiting for what would happen next. Richard's face hardened. "This is a private event. You don't belong here." His voice grew louder, echoing across the hall. "If you're here by mistake, I suggest you leave immediately." The room fell silent. It was as if the music, the chatter, and even the air had paused to hear what would happen. People leaned slightly forward, their curiosity piqued. The janitor stood under the chandelier's light, every wrinkle on his face visible, every mark of hard work clear on his hands. Yet, he did not look away. Carlos took a slow breath. His heart pounded inside his chest, but his voice, though soft, was steady. "I'm here for my daughter," he said. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Some guests looked at one another, puzzled. Whose father was he? Why was he here? The silence after his words felt even heavier than before. Richard blinked, caught off guard. His sharp tone softened for a fraction of a second, though his pride didn't allow him to show it. "Your daughter?" he asked, disbelief lacing his voice. "Yes," Carlos answered, his eyes calm though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "She asked me to come." The murmurs in the room grew louder. People turned, searching among themselves, until suddenly, a young woman stepped forward from the crowd. Her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Sofia Alvarez. She was known throughout the company as one of the brightest rising executives, sharp-minded, graceful, and respected by nearly everyone. Tonight she wore a navy blue dress that matched her confident stride. Her dark hair was tied neatly, her posture straight, her face glowing with both determination and pride. As soon as she appeared, the whispers multiplied. Sophia, the brilliant woman admired by so many, walked across the lobby straight toward the janitor. When she reached him, she smiled warmly and without hesitation wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Papa," she whispered, her voice full of love. The room gasped softly. Richard's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. The man he had just scolded so publicly, the one he had said didn't belong, was the father of his most promising executive. "Mr. Blake," Sophia said firmly, turning toward the CEO. "This is my father. I invited him tonight." The CEO opened his mouth but no words came. His pride battled with the sudden realization of his mistake. Around them, the guests shifted uncomfortably, some ashamed of their own whispers, others curious to see how Richard would handle the situation. Carlos, however, didn't seem angry or offended. His face carried the same calm expression as before, though his eyes glistened slightly when his daughter held onto him. He hadn't expected such a public confrontation, but he also hadn't expected his daughter to defend him so boldly. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Carlos said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I came because my daughter wanted me here. I came, because I am proud of her." His simple words cut through the heavy air like a gentle truth. For a moment, the lobby felt different, less like a place of power and more like a place where human hearts had been exposed. Richard cleared his throat, his face tight with unease. He was a man used to controlling every room he entered, but tonight, the control seemed to slip from his hands. He glanced at the crowd, noticing the subtle disapproval in some eyes, the sympathy in others. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of being wrong in front of his own people. Carlos lowered his eyes humbly, not seeking attention, not demanding respect. All he wanted was to honor his daughter's request. And in that moment, it was clear, though his clothes were humble, though his hands bore the calluses of labor, he belonged more than anyone realized. The music slowly resumed, though softer this time, and the crowd began to whisper again. But the story of what had just happened would not fade quickly. It would linger in their minds, how the janitor had stood tall, how he had spoken simply yet powerfully, and how the room had shifted because of a father's quiet love. The air in the lobby still carried the tension from the confrontation, though the music tried to smooth it over. Sophia stood firmly by her father's side, her hand resting gently on his arm as if to shield him from the stares of the guests. To her, this moment wasn't one of embarrassment, but of truth. She had spent years working hard, earning respect from colleagues who knew nothing about the man who had quietly sacrificed everything for her. Tonight was supposed to be the night she honored him, not the night he was humiliated. Carlos kept his eyes lowered, not because of shame, but because he was overwhelmed. He had never been in such a place, surrounded by glittering lights, expensive dresses, and voices that carried wealth in every tone. Yet here was his daughter, standing tall, beautiful, and unafraid. In that moment, he felt both out of place and deeply proud. Richard Blake, the CEO, shifted uncomfortably. His sharp words from earlier still echoed in his own ears, and now, standing before Sophia and her father, he realized his mistake. The crowd hadn't forgotten what he said. Their eyes lingered on him, some filled with judgment, some with curiosity. He cleared his throat and attempted to regain control. "Sophia," Richard said carefully, his tone much softer now. You could have mentioned this." Sophia lifted her chin. "I didn't think I had to explain who my father is," she replied, her voice steady but carrying a quiet strength that made people listen. "I invited him because this is my success, but it's also his. Everything I am, everything I have achieved, is because of him." Carlos's chest tightened as he heard her words. His daughter had always been grateful, always loving, but hearing her say it here in front of the very people who judged him felt like a gift beyond measure. He had once feared she might grow ashamed of him, the janitor in a worn uniform, but tonight proved the opposite. The guests whispered among themselves. Some nodded, touched by Sophia's courage, while others glanced at Richard to see how he would respond. The balance of power in the room had shifted. Richard opened his mouth but found himself speechless. He was not a man accustomed to apologies, especially not in public. Yet he couldn't ignore the truth in Sophia's words. His eyes flickered to Carlos, who stood quietly, not demanding anything, not angry, only present with a humble dignity. One of the executives in the crowd, an older man with silver hair, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "That's her father? The janitor? Incredible. No wonder she's so grounded." His colleague nodded, murmuring, "Makes sense now. Look at the way she carries herself. Discipline like that doesn't come out of nowhere." Sophia turned back to her father and smiled, trying to ease the heaviness of the moment. "Papa, I wanted you to see this. All these people, they know me for my work. But they don't know the story behind it. They don't know who gave me strength." Carlos blinked back the warmth in his eyes. His throat tightened, but he managed a soft response. "Mija, I didn't do anything special. I just wanted you to have a better life." "You did everything," Sophia whispered back, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Everything I have is because of you." The crowd was silent again, listening, almost forgetting their glasses and conversations. It wasn't just a family moment anymore, it was something that touched everyone present. They saw, in the simplest exchange of words, a reminder of love, sacrifice, and gratitude that money could never buy. Richard finally stepped forward, his pride cracking. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, addressing Carlos directly, though his tone was far less commanding than before. "I didn't realize," his words trailed off, and he exhaled, forcing himself to finish. "I didn't realize you were Sophia's father." Carlos looked at him, his eyes calm. "You didn't need to know who I was," he said gently. "I only came because she asked me. I came for her, not for anyone else." There was no bitterness in his voice, no accusation. Just honesty. That simplicity made Richard feel smaller than any boardroom failure ever had. Sophia tightened her grip on her father's arm and looked at her boss. "He belongs here, Mr. Blake. More than anyone else. Without him, I wouldn't be here at all." Those words landed heavily in the room. For years, Richard had measured belonging by wealth, power, and influence. Tonight, a janitor's quiet presence and his daughter's bold truth redefined it in front of everyone. A woman from the crowd, one of the senior managers, stepped closer and said softly, "Sophia, would you introduce us to your father?" Her voice carried kindness, breaking the awkwardness that still lingered. Sophia smiled. "Of course. Everyone, this is Carlos Alvarez, my father. He taught me the value of hard work, the meaning of sacrifice, and the importance of never giving up." Carlos lowered his head humbly as a few people began to clap, softly at first, then louder. The applause wasn't for his uniform or his title, it was for the man himself, for the story behind Sophia's success. The sound of clapping filled Carlos's chest with a feeling he couldn't describe. All his life he had worked quietly in the shadows, cleaning up after others, rarely noticed, rarely thanked. Yet tonight, in this grand place, people were clapping for him not because of what he wore, but because of who he was. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted them, not to wave, but simply to hold his daughter's hand tighter. The applause wasn't his victory alone, it was theirs together. Richard watched, his pride fighting with an unfamiliar respect. For years, he had believed success was a straight path paved with wealth and status. But here stood a man who had no wealth, no position of power, yet had achieved the greatest success of all, raising a daughter who not only excelled in her career but also carried the strength of gratitude and love. As the applause softened and conversations resumed, Carlos whispered to Sophia, "Maybe I should wait outside now. I don't want to cause more attention." Sophia shook her head firmly. "No, Papa. You're staying. Tonight is as much yours as it is mine. Her words left no room for argument. Carlos sighed quietly but smiled. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he truly belonged, not because the CEO allowed it, but because his daughter wanted it, and because he had earned it through years of love and sacrifice. The night moved on, but the atmosphere had changed. Where there had been whispers of doubt, there was now a respect. Where there had been tension, there was now quiet admiration. Guests no longer saw Carlos as just a janitor in a faded uniform, they saw him as the man behind the success of one of the company's brightest stars. And though Carlos remained humble, though he kept to the side with his quiet smile, his presence now carried a weight far greater than any title could hold. The music played softly in the background, but Carlos wasn't hearing it. As he stood beside his daughter in the shining lobby, surrounded by people who looked so different from him, his mind wandered back to the years that had brought him here. Memories rose up uninvited, like shadows from another life, each one carrying the weight of sacrifice and love. Long before this night, there had been small apartments with broken heaters, long nights of exhaustion, and mornings where he had to decide whether to pay for electricity or food. He could still remember the early years after his wife passed away. The world had felt heavy, almost unbearable, as he faced raising Sophia alone. She had been so young then, her eyes filled with questions he didn't always know how to answer. He remembered the first time she asked, "Papa, why do you come home so late?" He had smiled through his tiredness, brushing her hair from her forehead, and whispered, "Because I'm making sure you have what you need, Mija. So you can have a future." Every night, while others rested, he mopped hallways, scrubbed offices, and cleaned floors that gleamed for people who never knew his name. His body often ached, his back stiff from bending, his hands cracked from harsh cleaners. But he never complained. Each shift was another step toward Sophia's future, another promise kept. He recalled one winter evening, the cold biting through his thin jacket as he pushed his cart of supplies through the nearly empty building. Sophia had been home alone, waiting for him. He worked faster that night, hoping to make it back in time to help her with her school project. By the time he got home, it was almost midnight. She was asleep at the table, her little hands still clutching crayons. He had tucked her into bed and whispered, "One day, Sophia, you'll draw a life far brighter than this." And she had. Carlos's heart swelled as he glanced at her now, standing in her elegant dress, speaking confidently among powerful people. She had kept every promise her young self once made. She studied harder than anyone he knew, always determined, always pushing forward. He could still see her sitting at the kitchen table, the same table he had repaired many times, her books spread wide as she studied late into the night. He remembered the nights he sat quietly beside her, sipping black coffee to stay awake, even though he didn't understand half the things she was reading. Once, when she noticed him dozing off in his chair, she laughed and said, "Papa, you don't have to stay up with me." But he had shaken his head. "If you are awake, I am awake. I may not know the answers in your books, but I am here." Those were the words he lived by, "I am here." No matter how tired, no matter how heavy life felt, he made sure she never felt alone. The lobby lights shimmered against Sophia's earrings, but Carlos's mind painted a different picture: his daughter's old shoes with worn soles, the way she used to walk to school clutching a second-hand backpack. He remembered patching that backpack more times than he could count. He remembered the tears in her eyes when she told him she wanted to go to college but was afraid it would cost too much. That night, he had sat her down and said firmly, "You don't worry about money. You just study. I'll take care of the rest." And he did. He picked up extra shifts, working weekends and nights. Sometimes, his body begged for rest, but he reminded himself why he was doing it. Each paycheck wasn't just money, it was a building block of Sophia's dream. There had been moments of doubt, of course. Nights when the bills piled high, when the refrigerator was nearly empty, when he felt he had nothing more to give. But every time he looked at Sophia's determined face, he found strength again. He remembered the day she got her acceptance letter to college. She had run into their tiny kitchen, waving the envelope with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Papa! I got in," she cried. Carlos had held her tightly, his own tears falling silently. That day, he felt like every floor he had scrubbed, every night he had gone without sleep, had finally been worth it. But there was one moment, one memory, that stayed with him most of all. It was her graduation day. He had taken off work, something he rarely did, and borrowed a suit from a friend. Sitting in the crowd, surrounded by proud families, he felt out of place, his shoes scuffed and his hands still smelling faintly of cleaning supplies no matter how much he scrubbed them. But when Sophia walked across the stage in her cap and gown, her smile brighter than the lights, Carlos felt like the richest man in the world. After the ceremony, she had pulled him aside and said something he would never forget: "Papa, you cleaned floors so I could walk on this stage. This is your success as much as it is mine." Those words had carved themselves into his heart. Now, standing in the glittering lobby of Blake Enterprises, surrounded by people who judged him for his uniform, Carlos realized how far they had both come. He hadn't come tonight to prove himself. He hadn't come to impress anyone. He had come simply because his daughter had asked him to. Because no matter where she stood, whether in a classroom, on a stage, or in the middle of this elegant event, he wanted her to see that he was still there. He glanced at her again, seeing her confidence as she spoke with a group of colleagues who now looked at her with new admiration. They had seen her brilliance before, but tonight they were beginning to understand the roots of her strength. She had not been shaped by privilege, but by sacrifice. She had not grown up with ease, but with love that worked silently behind the scenes. Sophia caught her father's gaze and gave him a smile that carried a lifetime of unspoken gratitude. Carlos smiled back, his eyes misty, but his heart full. He didn't need recognition or applause. All he needed was the knowledge that his daughter knew the truth of what he had given, and that she had built a life worthy of every sacrifice. In that crowded room filled with wealth and ambition, Carlos realized something powerful. Success wasn't measured by the clothes he wore or the job title on his badge. It was measured by the daughter who now stood proudly, respected not only for her skills but also for the values she carried, the very values he had spent years teaching without ever needing books or speeches. And though no one else might know the full story of his journey, Carlos knew. Sophia knew. And that was enough. The evening carried on, but the energy in the room had shifted. The incident between the CEO and the janitor still lingered in everyone's memory, and though conversations had resumed, people kept glancing at Carlos and Sophia from time to time. What had begun as a sharp and humiliating moment was now turning into something different, something that touched the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Carlos stood quietly, never seeking attention. He was used to being invisible, blending into the background. Tonight was no different in his eyes. Yet, he couldn't ignore the stares, nor could he ignore the way his daughter stood beside him with quiet defiance, as if daring anyone to look down on him again. Richard Blake, the CEO, found himself unsettled. He had built his entire life on pride, image, and control. For years, people had looked at him with respect or fear. He was the man who had the final word in every deal, the man whose approval was worth more than gold. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt small. He couldn't shake Carlos's words from his mind: "I'm here for my daughter." Simple, direct, and filled with a love that Richard couldn't quite understand. Richard had wealth beyond measure, but he realized he had never spoken words with such truth in his own life. He glanced around the room. People still admired him, of course, but their admiration had dimmed. He saw judgment in their eyes, disappointment even. They had seen him lash out, and then they had seen a janitor respond with calm dignity. That image would stay with them, it would stay with him. Sophia's voice carried over the music as she introduced her father to more colleagues. She didn't hide him, didn't lower her voice in shame. Instead, she spoke proudly, as though he were the guest of honor. Each time she said the words "my father," Carlos lowered his eyes shyly, but his heart swelled. Richard took a step closer, his shoes clicking softly against the marble. The crowd near him fell silent, watching. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the powerful CEO confronting the quiet janitor once more. But this time, Richard's tone was not sharp. "Mr. Alvarez," he said, his voice quieter, gentler. "Would you join us at the front table?" The room went still. Eyes widened. No one had ever heard Richard Blake invite anyone so humbly, let alone someone in a janitor's uniform. Carlos looked at him in surprise, unsure how to respond. He had never sat at such a table, never been offered such a place. His instinct was to decline, to stay in the background where he felt safe. But before he could speak, Sophia squeezed his hand. Her eyes shone with encouragement, silently urging him to accept. "Thank you," Carlos finally said, his voice steady. "If it's all right, I'll stay where I am. I don't need to be at the front. I'm just here for my daughter." His humility only deepened the respect in the room. People nodded, some even smiled softly. They saw a man who had no desire for status, no hunger for recognition. He was content with love alone. But Sophia wasn't ready to let him fade back into the shadows. She stepped forward, her voice rising just enough for the room to hear. "Everyone here knows me as an executive, as a professional. But tonight, I want you all to know the truth behind my story. This is my father. He worked nights, weekends, and holidays to give me opportunities. He cleaned floors so I could study. He carried burdens so I could carry dreams." Her words echoed through the hall, silencing even the clinking of glasses. "Everything you see in me," she continued, her eyes moist but her voice strong, "comes from him. And I will never be ashamed to say that." The applause began slowly, one pair of hands clapping, then another, until the entire hall was filled with the sound. People rose from their seats, giving a standing ovation. Some wiped their eyes, others smiled proudly at Sophia and Carlos. Carlos stood frozen, overwhelmed. He had never imagined such a moment. He had always believed his sacrifices would remain unseen, known only to him and his daughter. To hear her declare it so boldly, to see strangers applauding for him, left him speechless. His throat tightened as he whispered, "Gracias, Mija." Richard stood still, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, his heart softened. He realized how empty his own definition of success had been. He had measured everything in profits, deals, and power, but he had ignored the things that truly mattered: love, sacrifice, humility. Looking at Carlos, he saw a man who had none of Richard's wealth but who carried something far richer. The applause faded, but the respect remained. Conversations shifted from business deals to reflections on family and sacrifice. People approached Carlos, shaking his hand, thanking him for raising a daughter like Sophia. Each interaction made him blush, his humility shining brighter than the chandeliers above. Richard finally stepped forward again. This time, his pride was gone. His voice carried sincerity as he spoke. "Mr. Alvarez, I owe you an apology. I spoke without thinking, and I judged without knowing. I see now that you belong here more than most of us. Please forgive me." Carlos looked at him calmly, his eyes kind. "There is nothing to forgive," he said softly. "We all see things differently until life teaches us another way." Those words struck Richard deeply. For years, he had believed he was the teacher, the leader, the one others learned from. But tonight, it was the janitor who had taught him the greatest lesson. The evening continued, but its meaning had changed. The event was no longer just about the company's success, it was about the human story that had unfolded in front of everyone. Guests left with more than just business conversations, they carried with them a reminder of what truly mattered. Sophia stayed close to her father, her heart lighter than ever. She had feared bringing him might embarrass him, that people might judge. But instead, he had shown the entire company the strength of humility. She looked at him with admiration, realizing that while she had always seen him as her hero, tonight the world had seen it too. As the night drew to a close, Richard approached Carlos once more. He placed a hand gently on his shoulder, a gesture of respect rather than authority. "You've given me something to think about," he admitted. "Maybe I've been chasing the wrong things." Carlos simply nodded, offering a small smile. "Sometimes, the greatest success is just being there for the ones you love." Richard said nothing more. He knew those words would stay with him long after the evening ended. When the lights dimmed and the guests began to leave, Carlos walked beside his daughter toward the exit. He didn't need a fancy table or a place of honor. The real honor was walking proudly with Sophia, knowing she had shared his story, knowing she wasn't ashamed of him. And though his uniform still marked him as a janitor, tonight it had also marked him as something far greater, the father whose love had changed everything. The night had finally begun to wind down. Guests were leaving one by one, their shoes tapping lightly against the marble floors as the grand lobby slowly emptied. The chandeliers above still glowed brightly, but the mood in the room had softened. What had started as a celebration of business success had ended as something far deeper, a lesson in love, humility, and respect. Carlos stood near the entrance with Sophia by his side. He watched people shake hands, exchange polite smiles, and step into their luxury cars waiting outside. Many of those same people, who earlier had looked at him with curiosity or even judgment, now stopped to greet him warmly before leaving. Some placed a hand on his shoulder, some bowed their heads politely, and others simply said, "It was an honor meeting you." Each gesture surprised Carlos. He wasn't used to attention, let alone admiration. For years he had been invisible in buildings like this one. His work had been noticed only when something went wrong, a missed spot, a broken bin, a forgotten corner. Tonight, however, he had been noticed for who he truly was, a father who never gave up. Sophia, holding his arm proudly, whispered, "Papa, do you see? They respect you now." Carlos smiled softly and shook his head. "Mija, respect is not something I need from strangers. I already have all the respect I want from you." His words made her heart swell. She leaned against him for a moment, just as she used to when she was a child, resting her head against his shoulder. "You'll always have it," she said firmly. Richard Blake, the CEO, had been quiet for some time, standing near the staircase as he observed everything. He wasn't the same man who had raised his voice earlier in the night. The arrogance in his expression had melted into something more thoughtful, more humble. When the last of the guests had left, he finally approached Carlos and Sophia once more. "Mr. Alvarez," Richard began, his voice steady but not commanding. "I want to thank you for staying, for teaching me something tonight. I've been leading this company for many years, but I think I've been blind to what really matters. You reminded me." Carlos looked at him kindly. "I didn't try to teach anything. I only came because my daughter asked me." "Sometimes," Richard said, nodding slowly, "the greatest lessons come when we're not trying to teach." Sophia studied her boss carefully. She had always respected him for his discipline and achievements, but tonight she saw a different side of him, a man who, beneath the pride, still had the ability to change. Richard extended his hand to Carlos. For a moment, Carlos hesitated, but then he reached out and shook it. The handshake was firm but gentle, not one of superiority, but of equals. It was a gesture that spoke louder than words, respect, recognition, and even apology. When it was time to leave, Sophia and Carlos stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled around them, tall buildings stretching toward the sky. Cars honked in the distance, and people hurried along the sidewalks, but for Carlos, the world felt still. He inhaled deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. As they walked toward the bus stop, Sophia slipped her hand into his. "Papa, tonight was for you. You've always said you didn't need recognition, but I wanted the world to see what I see. I wanted them to know who you are." Carlos squeezed her hand gently. "And now they know. But remember, Mija, I never needed them to know. It was enough that you did." Sophia's eyes glistened. "I know. But it matters to me that they respect you. You deserve it." Carlos smiled. "Respect is nice, but love is what matters. And I have your love. That is enough for me." They waited quietly at the bus stop, the night air wrapping around them. Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, she wasn't the polished executive in her elegant dress. She was simply his daughter, the little girl who once held his hand on the way to school, who once cried over homework at their kitchen table, who once promised to make him proud. And she had. As the bus approached, its headlights glowing in the dark, Carlos felt a warmth spread through him. He thought of the faces in the lobby, the applause, the way people had looked at him differently. But most of all, he thought of his daughter's smile, the pride in her eyes, and the way she had stood beside him without fear. When they boarded the bus, a few passengers glanced at Sophia's elegant dress and Carlos's janitor uniform. But this time, Carlos didn't feel out of place. He didn't feel small. He sat tall, holding his daughter's hand, knowing that tonight he had been seen not for his uniform, not for his job, but for his heart. As the bus rumbled through the city streets, Carlos's thoughts drifted once more. He imagined his wife watching from above, smiling at the daughter they had raised together, proud of the man he had tried to be. He whispered silently, "She's everything we dreamed she would be." Sophia noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "Papa, what are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that life was hard, but it was worth it. Every night, every sacrifice, every step, it was worth it for this moment." Sophia's throat tightened with emotion. She rested her head back on his shoulder, closing her eyes. "I love you, Papa." "I love you too, Mija," Carlos whispered, his voice steady, filled with all the strength of years gone by. Back at his modest apartment later that night, Carlos placed the folded invitation on the small wooden table. It was just a piece of paper, but to him, it was a symbol of everything he had lived for. He looked around at the simple home they had built together, a home filled with memories, laughter, and struggles, and he smiled. He didn't need wealth, he didn't need a mansion, and he didn't need the world's approval. He had something greater, his daughter's success and her love. Meanwhile, at his own luxurious home, Richard Blake sat alone in his office. The applause for Carlos still echoed in his ears. For the first time in years, he felt a strange emptiness in his wealth. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at his reflection in the window. "What is all this," he whispered, "if I don't have what he has?" He thought of his own children, grown and distant, their calls rare, their love shallow. For all his wealth, he had failed to give them what Carlos had given Sophia. He felt a pang of regret, but also a spark of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Back in his small apartment, Carlos sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. His hands were tired, his body weary, but his heart was light. Tonight, he had walked into a room where he was told he didn't belong, and yet, he had left as the most honored man there. Not because of wealth. Not because of status. But because he had lived his life for love, and love had spoken louder than any title, louder than any insult, louder than anything else in the world. And as he drifted off to sleep, Carlos Alvarez smiled, knowing that while he would return to work in the morning, scrubbing floors and carrying his bucket, everything had changed. People would greet him differently now, with respect. But even if they didn't, it wouldn't matter. He had already won the greatest victory of all. He had been there for his daughter, and in her eyes, he was a hero.